A small Texas church becomes the backdrop for a scandalous love affair between Brian Jones, a revered preacher, Chris Morgan, a talented musician, and Abigail, Brian's devoted wife. The story begins with a facade of an ideal marriage and a harmonious congregation, but beneath the surface, the lives of these individuals are anything but perfect. The preacher, admired by all, is hiding his deepest desires, while Chris, a gifted musician, is grappling with his own turmoil. Abigail, unaware of the growing tension, continues to stand by her husband's side. Chris Morgan, a 34-year-old musician, finds solace in his deepening connection with Brian Jones, the charismatic preacher of a small Texas church. Initially, their bond begins purely from a shared love of faith and music. Brian takes Chris under his wing, mentoring him in ways that go beyond church matters. The two men spend hours together, discussing not only the gospel but also personal struggles and emotions. Brian, a man revered by the congregation, seems like a perfect role model for Chris, someone who brings stability and wisdom. As their friendship grows, it becomes clear that there is something stronger than mere mentorship. Chris begins to feel a pull toward Brian that he cannot fully understand. Brian, too, notices the growing intensity between them, but brushes it aside, convincing himself that the closeness is simply part of their bond. Yet, as the days pass, both men begin to grapple with feelings that defy friendship. It's late one evening after a particularly moving church service. The congregation has dispersed, and Chris stays behind to speak with Brian, who has been his guiding force for months. As they talk in the empty church, their conversation takes a more personal turn. Chris reveals his struggles with loneliness and past trauma, looking for the support and comfort that Brian has always been able to provide. Brian, sensing Chris's pain, places a hand on his shoulder in a reassuring gesture. It's meant to be an act of comfort, but the touch lingers longer than expected, and an electric tension crackles in the air. Chris, feeling an unfamiliar warmth spread through him, locks eyes with Brian, and for a moment, neither man speaks. The contact, innocent as it seems, feels heavier than either is willing to admit. In the silence that follows, the bond between them shifts, and both men are left questioning the intensity of their connection. The first spark of desire is ignited, even if neither is ready to confront it. As the weeks pass, the bond between Brian and Chris grows deeper, transcending the boundaries of friendship. What began as late-night conversations about faith and personal struggles begins to transform into something far more intimate. It's subtle at first, small, lingering touches, meaningful glances, and moments of vulnerability exchanged between them. Their meetings no longer feel innocent. The guilt of what they're beginning to feel weighs on both men, but neither is ready to confront it. There's an undeniable pull, an attraction neither can ignore. One night after a particularly emotional conversation, their connection escalates. In the quiet of the church, with only the soft hum of the organ in the background, Brian takes Chris's hand in his. The gesture, meant to comfort, carries with it an unmistakable charge. Both of them know it's more than just friendship now, yet they continue to navigate this dangerous path. They begin an affair, though unspoken, understood implicitly. It's not about lust at first, it's about need, the need to be understood, desired, and accepted. But soon, their affair deepens, and both men become consumed by this new dynamic. They steal kisses, exchange secret words, and hold each other in moments of intense passion. Each encounter brings them further into a web of deceit, and with every passing day they find it harder to stay away. As the affair progresses, the signs of Brian and Chris's growing closeness become harder to ignore. However, both Abigail, Brian's wife, and Vanessa, Chris's wife, are completely oblivious to the changes taking place. Brian's absences become more frequent. He excuses himself under the guise of church-related duties, yet the hours spent away from home stretch longer. His excuses grow thinner, and he becomes increasingly distant, but Abigail never suspects a thing. She believes in her husband's integrity and is lulled by his reassurances. Similarly, Chris's withdrawal from Vanessa is unnoticed. He spends more time at church, sometimes even overnight, telling her that it's for music practice or reflection. Vanessa's suspicions never arise. After all, Chris has always been dedicated to his work. What neither woman can see, however, are the small unspoken changes in their marriages, the subtle shifts in their husbands' behaviors. They don't know that behind closed doors, something sinister is brewing. Both men hide their growing emotional and physical attraction, wearing masks of normalcy when they're around their wives. The emotional toll of the affair weighs heavily on Brian and Chris, but they bury it, convincing themselves that what they're doing is justifiable. Their wives unknowingly are left in the dark as they continue to trust and support their husbands, oblivious to the duplicity unfolding before them. The secrecy of the affair begins to take its toll on both Brian and Chris. They live their lives as if they are walking on a tightrope, always fearful of being discovered. The excitement of their hidden passion starts to feel more like a burden. Every glance, every conversation, every touch is laden with the fear of exposure. They begin to second-guess themselves. Should they be meeting in the church late at night? Should they send these texts that are so loaded with meaning? Every interaction carries the weight of what they are hiding. Brian, once a pillar of the community, finds himself losing his sense of self. The constant balancing act between his public role as a preacher and his private affair begins to cause a rift in his sense of morality. His once deep connection to his faith now feels like an act, a role he's playing in a life that no longer aligns with his true desires. Chris, on the other hand, struggles with the duality of his emotions. His love for Brian grows, but he's trapped in a marriage with Vanessa, someone he still cares about. Though the attraction between them has waned, he finds it harder to focus on his music and his duties as a husband. The affair has seeped into every corner of his life, leaving him exhausted and emotionally drained. The strain of maintaining a facade becomes nearly unbearable. Both men start to feel the weight of their secret lives pressing in on them from all sides, and as they continue their affair, they know that one mistake could unravel everything. As the affair between Brian and Chris continues, the trust that once existed between the two men begins to deteriorate. Brian, caught between his duty to his church and his growing feelings for Chris, finds himself in a precarious position. He begins to notice subtle changes in his own behavior, an increasing sense of guilt that gnaws at him, but also a deeper emotional connection to Chris that he can't deny. However, the deeper betrayal surfaces when Vanessa, Chris's wife, starts seeking comfort from Brian. As she begins to sense a growing distance between herself and Chris, she turns to Brian for support. At first, it's innocent. A few casual conversations about her frustrations with Chris and her feelings of loneliness in their marriage. But as their emotional bond deepens, the lines blur between what is friendship and what is an affair. Brian listens with growing empathy to Vanessa's pain. He sees in her the same vulnerability he once saw in Chris. Over time, their late-night conversations and shared moments of emotional intimacy give birth to a secret relationship. Brian, who once considered Chris his best friend, now finds himself emotionally entangled in both men's lives, creating a web of deceit and betrayal that threatens to destroy everyone involved. Chris, blind to the growing closeness between Brian and his wife, remains focused on his own affair with Brian, but Vanessa's shifting emotions mark the beginning of a new betrayal, one that will eventually complicate and magnify the fallout. The affair between Brian and Vanessa reaches a critical point one evening when they meet in private to discuss their respective struggles. Vanessa, overwhelmed by her troubled marriage, opens up about her feelings of neglect and emotional isolation. Brian, already feeling the weight of his own guilt, finds it hard to separate his feelings for her from his role as a pastor. As the conversation becomes more personal and intimate, the connection between them grows undeniable. Vanessa's pain and Brian's sympathy lead to a fragile moment of vulnerability. With a gentle but desperate tenderness, Brian reaches out to touch her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear. It is in this intimate moment that their relationship changes forever. As if drawn by an invisible force, they share their first kiss. The kiss is soft at first, filled with emotion, but as it deepens, it becomes an overwhelming expression of their suppressed desires. The guilt that comes with it is drowned out by the intensity of their feelings for each other. For both of them, it is a turning point, a moment where they can no longer deny what has been building between them. The kiss is a commitment to the affair, a choice that will change everything moving forward. Vanessa pulls away first, her face flushed with shame and excitement, but Brian can only offer her a strained smile. The kiss is their secret now, and it will soon be impossible to undo. The tangled web of deceit deepens as Brian and Vanessa continue their secret affair. While the physical and emotional bond between them grows stronger, they both know that their actions can never be discovered. Vanessa is still married to Chris, and Brian, a respected pastor in the community, carries the heavy burden of his dual life. The affair is thrilling and dangerous, a forbidden escape from the constraints of their respective lives. Despite the secrecy, the relationship is far from casual. They have stolen moments together, private conversations, secret rendezvous, and stolen kisses in the dark. The affair becomes an obsession for both of them, but they know the risks. Their actions could ruin their marriages, destroy their relationships, and shatter the illusion of trust they once had with the people closest to them. The deceit runs so deep that neither of them can truly escape its grasp. Vanessa is more and more detached from her husband Chris, unable to engage with him emotionally. Meanwhile, Brian finds himself struggling to maintain his professional role while grappling with a growing affection for Vanessa. They begin to cover up their affair even more carefully, crafting elaborate stories to explain the odd gaps in their lives when questioned by friends or spouses. But despite their careful efforts, cracks begin to show. Both men feel something is amiss, though neither can articulate their suspicions, unaware that the truth is waiting to destroy them. The affair takes a dramatic turn when Vanessa discovers she is pregnant. A rush of emotions floods her as she realizes the gravity of the situation. She is unsure whether the child belongs to Chris, her husband, or Brian, her lover. The timing suggests it could be Brian's child, and the prospect of carrying his baby adds another layer of complexity and guilt to the situation. Vanessa grapples with the magnitude of her decision. Telling Chris would expose the affair and likely end their marriage. Telling Brian, on the other hand, means admitting to him the full scope of her deception. Her internal turmoil escalates as her body begins to change. She avoids Chris as much as possible, knowing that the physical signs of pregnancy will soon become impossible to hide. The emotional distance between them grows, and Chris starts to notice Vanessa's increased irritability, tiredness, and evasiveness. Meanwhile, Vanessa desperately tries to figure out a way to navigate the wreckage of her life. She is torn between her love for Brian, the guilt she feels for betraying Chris, and the reality that her life is about to be irrevocably changed by this pregnancy. The secret becomes a ticking time bomb that she is unable to defuse. The affair that once felt thrilling now feels like a burden she can't carry alone. Chris has started noticing inconsistencies in Vanessa's behavior, but it isn't until the pregnancy that the cracks in their marriage truly begin to show. Initially, he assumes that the stress from work and their young family might be the reason for her growing distance, but as weeks pass, his concern deepens. Vanessa, though outwardly composed, seems more distracted and less affectionate toward him. She brushes off his attempts to connect with her emotionally, always giving vague answers to his questions about her well-being. Chris notices that she's becoming increasingly withdrawn even when they share moments alone. Something feels off, but Chris can't quite pinpoint what it is. Her mood swings become more pronounced, and he begins to notice her irregular behavior, staying out late without clear explanations, growing defensive when he asks about her day, and avoiding physical intimacy altogether. Meanwhile, his mind races with thoughts of possible infidelity. He wants to trust her, but his instincts are starting to scream that something is terribly wrong. The seed of doubt is planted, and Chris's suspicions grow. The pregnancy, which should have been a time of joy, only heightens his unease. Chris begins to privately question if the child is his, noting how Vanessa's distance from him coincides with the exact time frame when their intimacy had faltered. Each passing day brings new doubts, and the tension between them becomes unbearable. He's emotionally conflicted, not knowing whether to confront her or to wait for the truth to surface on its own. But the more Chris thinks about the situation, the more he's sure that something has happened that he hasn't been able to fully grasp. Chris can no longer keep his suspicions bottled up. He can feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His frustrations, his growing feelings of betrayal, and the gnawing doubts compel him to confront Vanessa. One evening, after weeks of internal conflict, he sits her down. His eyes are filled with both pain and anger as he calmly tells her he needs the truth. "Vanessa," Chris says, his voice trembling slightly, "I know something's wrong. I can feel it. You've been distant, avoiding me, and now there's the pregnancy. Tell me the truth. Are you having an affair?" Vanessa's face pales. She's been waiting for this moment but never expected it to be so difficult. Her heartbeat quickens and she looks away, unable to meet his gaze. She feels a mixture of guilt and shame weighing heavily on her chest. The words she has been dreading to say for so long now loom before her. After a long silence, she finally admits, her voice breaking, "Yes, I've been seeing someone else. It's Brian." She chokes back tears as she watches Chris's face contort with disbelief and hurt. The weight of the confession hangs in the air, and Chris's world begins to collapse around him. He stands frozen, unable to process what he's just heard. The love of his life, the woman he's trusted, has betrayed him with his best friend. "How long?" he demands, his voice barely above a whisper. Vanessa, avoiding his gaze, responds softly, A year. Chris is shaken, his mind racing as the magnitude of the betrayal settles in. The pain is unbearable, but it's only the beginning of his emotional descent. He demands to know whether the baby is his, but Vanessa's hesitation is all it takes for him to realize that the child is Brian's. In that instant, Chris feels his trust and his heart shatter into pieces. His mind is flooded with rage, but he's still in shock. His chest tightens and he stumbles back, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. The confrontation leaves him devastated, confused, and angrier than he's ever been. The anger soon gives way to a darker, more destructive force, a need for revenge. Chris is consumed by a torrent of emotions after the confrontation. He can't stop replaying the moment over and over in his mind. Every time he thinks of Vanessa and Brian together, a new wave of fury washes over him. The realization that his wife, the woman he devoted himself to, and his best friend, the man he trusted above all others, have betrayed him cuts deep. His mind turns dark, filled with thoughts of retribution. Unable to process his emotions in a healthy way, Chris's anger spills into every aspect of his life. At work he is short-tempered and irritable, snapping at colleagues and friends alike. At home he becomes increasingly volatile, withdrawing from his children and lashing out at Vanessa whenever they interact. He has no control over his outbursts and the rage feels all-consuming. At times he wonders if his actions are even his own, or if something inside him has snapped beyond repair. Every night he lies awake, staring at the ceiling, seething with anger and plotting revenge. He fixates on Brian and Vanessa, thinking of the betrayal as a personal affront to his very sense of self-worth. His perception of his life is distorted, as if the entire world has conspired against him. The once calm, rational man is now a volcano waiting to erupt. As the days go by, Chris isolates himself further. He spends more time away from home, engaging in reckless behavior, drinking heavily, and seeking distractions to numb the pain. In his twisted mind, he begins to justify the need for revenge, convinced that he has been wronged to such an extent that he deserves to make both of them pay. Chris's obsession with vengeance reaches a fever pitch. The more he dwells on the betrayal, the more convinced he becomes that he has no choice but to exact punishment. He begins to plot how he will make Brian suffer for the destruction of his life. The plans become more detailed, and Chris's mind grows darker with every passing day. The rational man he once was is gone, replaced by a figure consumed by hatred and desire for revenge. After weeks of planning, Chris knows exactly what he needs to do. He believes that ending Brian's life will somehow restore his own sense of justice, that it will balance the scales of betrayal. He makes the decision to confront Brian in the place that once symbolized peace and community, the church. A place that had brought them both comfort and solace is now the site of Chris's ultimate act of vengeance. The church, eerily quiet and empty, becomes the stage for a violent and tragic confrontation. Chris arrives first, pacing back and forth, his nerves frayed. He can hear the sound of his own heartbeat as he prepares to face Brian. When Brian enters, startled to find Chris waiting for him, Chris wastes no time. His fury boils over as he accuses Brian of ruining his life, destroying everything he held dear. Brian tries to plead with him, but Chris, lost in his rage, ignores his attempts to reason. The conversation quickly escalates, and in a moment of blind fury, Chris pulls out a gun. The cold steel of the weapon feels like a symbol of the darkness inside him. Without warning, Chris pulls the trigger. The shot echoes through the church, a sound that will haunt both their lives forever. Brian falls to the ground, blood staining the altar as he collapses. Chris stands over him, panting, his mind spinning with the aftermath of what he's just done. The satisfaction he hoped to feel is absent, replaced by a heavy, crushing weight of guilt and disbelief. But it's too late. The damage is done. The tension in the church is palpable. Chris, his heart pounding in his chest, waits for Brian to arrive. The sacred space which once symbolized peace, community, and personal reflection now feels like the stage for a tragic showdown. Chris's mind is clouded with rage, but deep down, a part of him still struggles with the reality of his actions. His thoughts flicker back to the man he once called a best friend, a man he had trusted implicitly for years. How could Brian, of all people, betray him like this? As the doors creak open, Brian steps into the church. He freezes for a moment upon seeing Chris standing there, his eyes hollow, his face filled with an emotion Chris can't quite read. There's a brief pause, an unspoken recognition between them. This confrontation was inevitable, but no one truly anticipated it would end in violence. Brian, visibly shaken, takes a tentative step forward. "Chris, I don't know what to say. Please, let's talk. This isn't the way..." but Chris cuts him off. "No more talking, Brian," he says, his voice shaking with emotion. "You've taken everything from me, my life, my family, my trust, all of it, and now you expect me to just forgive you?" Brian opens his mouth to speak, but the words seem to fail him. There's nothing he can say to undo the pain, the devastation he has caused. For the first time, Chris sees Brian not as a friend, but as a man who has deeply wronged him, a man who is now a symbol of his deepest betrayal. In the charged silence, Chris steps toward him, his anger palpable. "You ruined my life, Brian. You don't deserve mercy," he spits, his voice rising. The church feels like an altar of vengeance, and Chris's eyes burn with a desperate need to make Brian understand the depth of his pain. The moment hangs in the air like a sword poised to strike. Brian, desperate to de-escalate, tries to reach out. "Chris, I never meant to hurt you. This wasn't supposed to happen." But Chris is beyond reasoning. His mind is consumed with the anger of betrayal, of being lied to by the people he loved most. The man who was once his best friend is now an enemy, one who deserves to feel the same pain Chris feels. As the words spill out, the church, once a peaceful sanctuary, becomes the tragic backdrop for a storm of emotions, a place that will forever be tied to the worst moment of Chris's life. The church, once a sacred space filled with hope, is now tainted with violence. The raw tension between the two men is unbearable, a volatile mix of past friendship and present rage. Every word exchanged, every breath taken, only seems to intensify the inevitable. Chris, his anger reaching a boiling point, takes a step back, his chest heaving with emotion. Then, without warning, Chris pulls out the gun he had hidden in his jacket. It's a symbol of his decision, his resolve to end the suffering in his own way. The metal feels cold and foreign in his hand, but in that moment, it feels like the only thing that will bring him any form of release from the suffocating anger that has been building up inside him for so long. "Chris, please," Brian pleads, his voice now strained with fear. "Don't do this. We can still fix this. We're friends. We can find a way to move forward." But Chris can no longer hear reason. His vision is clouded with a deep, overwhelming sense of injustice, a feeling that everything he's known has been torn away from him by the two people he trusted most in the world. His grip on the gun tightens, his hand shaking from the weight of what he's about to do. There's no going back now. The shot rings out, echoing through the church, the sound of it vibrating in the very walls around them. Brian stumbles back, his eyes wide with shock and confusion. A look of disbelief crosses his face before he collapses onto the cold church floor, blood quickly staining the polished surface beneath him. Chris stands frozen for a moment, his heart hammering in his chest. The horror of what he's just done washes over him like a cold wave, but the weight of his actions doesn't fully hit until he hears the sound of footsteps approaching. It's too late for remorse now. Brian's body is lifeless, the bright red blood pooling on the floor, staining everything Chris had once held dear. As the sound of sirens fills the air, Chris drops the gun, his hands trembling. The reality of the situation crashes down on him. He has just taken another man's life, and no matter what happens next, there is no undoing the irreversible. In the wake of the shooting, chaos consumes the church. The sound of sirens grows louder, and soon police and paramedics flood the scene, rushing to take control of the situation. The church, a place of worship and solace, is now a crime scene, its sanctity shattered beyond repair. Brian's lifeless body is quickly covered, and the reality of his death sinks into the hearts of everyone who knew him. News of the shooting spreads like wildfire. Vanessa, upon hearing what has happened, is struck with a deep sense of guilt and disbelief. She can't fathom what has transpired, the culmination of her affair and the irreversible violence that followed. She is left in the wreckage of her choices, knowing that the man she loved has just taken another life as a result of her betrayal. Abigail, Brian's wife, arrives at the church, her face pale with shock. The sight of her husband's body is too much for her to bear. She collapses in grief, clutching at her heart as if the physical pain might somehow alleviate the emotional torment she's feeling. The love of her life is gone, taken by the man who was supposed to be his best friend. Her mind struggles to comprehend the magnitude of the situation, torn between disbelief and heartbreak. Chris, meanwhile, is taken into police custody. His emotions are a tangled mess of guilt, anger, and profound regret. His life has taken a devastating turn, and there is no coming back from this. The haunting image of Brian lying lifeless on the church floor will stay with him forever, a reminder of the irreversible decision he made in a moment of overwhelming pain. The consequences of Chris's actions spread far and wide. The lives of all involved are irrevocably changed. What was once a tight-knit community is now fractured, a shell of what it used to be. The aftermath of the shooting leaves a void that nothing can fill. As the weeks pass, the case against Chris moves into the courtroom. The community watches with bated breath as the trial begins. It's a spectacle for the public, and emotions run high as the facts are laid bare. The courtroom is filled with tension, the air thick with anger, grief, and uncertainty. The prosecution makes their case, portraying Chris as a man driven by jealousy and rage, a man who took the law into his own hands when he was faced with the ultimate betrayal. They paint a picture of a man consumed by bitterness, whose actions were premeditated and fueled by anger. The defense, however, attempts to offer a different perspective. They argue that Chris was emotionally unstable, his actions the result of overwhelming pain and suffering. They paint Chris as a victim, someone pushed to the edge by the betrayal of his wife and best friend. They ask for compassion, pleading for a more lenient sentence given the emotional turmoil he endured. As the trial progresses, Vanessa and Abigail are called to the stand. Vanessa, with tears in her eyes, tries to explain her actions and the impact it had on everyone involved. She is racked with guilt, knowing that the affair and her pregnancy were the catalyst for the tragic events that followed. She speaks about her remorse, but the weight of her actions feels too much to bear. Abigail, on the other hand, is a picture of grief and sorrow. She speaks about her late husband Brian and the pain of losing him in such a violent and senseless way. Her words are filled with anguish, and it's clear to the jury that the impact of Brian's death has left a permanent scar on her soul. The trial becomes a public spectacle, drawing attention from local media and stirring up passionate opinions on both sides of the case. People in the community are torn, some sympathizing with Chris's emotional plight, while others condemn his violent actions. The courtroom is a microcosm of the town itself, divided and broken by the events that transpired. As the trial progresses, the case becomes a hot-button issue, sparking intense debates in the town and beyond. Social media is flooded with opinions, and news outlets cover every detail of the trial, from the testimony of Vanessa and Abigail to the closing arguments of both the prosecution and defense. People are divided in their opinions. Some view Chris as a man pushed beyond his limits, someone who reacted out of pain and confusion after being betrayed by the people he loved most. They argue that while his actions were extreme, they can understand the emotional torment that led to the tragedy. Others, however, believe that Chris's actions were unforgivable. They see him as a murderer who took the law into his own hands, ignoring the moral and legal implications of his decision. His rage, they argue, should not have been an excuse for the senseless killing of another person. The outcry in the public sphere intensifies as the trial draws to a close. People argue about justice, morality, and the nature of betrayal. The impact of the case is felt far beyond the courtroom, affecting the entire town and challenging the community's views on loyalty, retribution, and the consequences of betrayal. After weeks of tense deliberation, the jury finally delivers its verdict. Chris is found guilty of first-degree murder. The court acknowledges the emotional turmoil he endured due to the betrayal by his wife and best friend, but ultimately, the crime of taking another man's life cannot be excused. The judge sentences Chris to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence is met with mixed reactions from the public. Some feel that justice has been served, while others argue that Chris was a victim of his circumstances, a man who lost control in a moment of overwhelming emotional pain. For Chris, the reality of his life sentence sets in as he is led away from the courtroom. He is no longer the man he once was. The man who sought vengeance, the man who took a life, is now a prisoner, forced to reckon with the consequences of his actions. The punishment may be harsh, but there is no escaping the emotional and moral consequences of what he has done. As the case comes to a close, the community is left to rebuild. The wounds caused by the betrayal, the shooting, and the trial will never fully heal, but life goes on. Chris's story serves as a sobering reminder of the destructive power of unchecked anger and the irrevocable consequences of betrayal.